Find the derivative of g of t equals sine squared of 6 minus 5t. G of t here is made up of a trig function, sine squared of 6 minus 5t. Let's remember that sine squared means the sine first, so sine of 6 minus 5t, and then the entire thing squared. It's a good idea to write it that way to show us the order of which to take the derivative. The outermost function here is actually the squared power, the second power, and that means we start with the power rule. The derivative g prime of t will be bring the power down, so a 2, leave the inside alone exactly as we see it, so sine of 6 minus 5t. Subtract 1 from the power, so it'll now be to the first power, but since the inside of that power was not just a t, but rather an entire expression, now we do the derivative of the inside. Well, here's the inside of the power. And inside of there we have a sign of a quantity, so the derivative will start with the sign. The derivative sign is cosine. And we'll have cosine of, leave the inside alone, 6 minus 5t. Well, the inside of that trig function is not just a t, but rather an entire expression. So now we take the derivative of the inside of that. It's a double chain rule. Derivative of 6 minus 5t will be 0 and then minus 5, so a negative 5. And that multiplies the entire thing. So double chain rule. We have a 6 minus 5t inside of a sign, which itself is inside of a square. We have that inside of that inside of that. And that's why you have a double chain rule. Now the negative 5, I'm going to move to the front, and we'll have a negative 10. Sine of 6 minus 5t, and then cosine of 6 minus 5t. So there's one way to write the derivative. There is an optional way to write it, and we may want to check that out, because we have a sine times a cosine, and we have a 2. And a 2 sine cosine can be rewritten. So here's an optional way to write this result. G prime of t is a 2 sine of 6 minus 5t and a cosine of 6 minus 5t times a negative 5. And 2 sine cosine is the sine, it's the double angle formula in reverse, so it's going to be the sine of 2 times 6 minus 5t. That negative 5 will just sit in front of it. And we'll have negative 5, the sine of the double angle formula, 2 times the angle is what's inside 6 minus 5t. There's an optional way to write it. Now we can distribute that too. And so we can write this as negative 5 sine of 12 minus 10t. There's an optional way to write the derivative. Either the above version or the below version is valid. Be aware of both of them. And there's our derivative g prime of t.